As Renee said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the results from a new report that we just did for the Wallace Foundation about principal professional learning. And Renee had that also had a way that you can access the report, but that QR code will take you to it. The report itself is called Understanding the Landscape of Professional Learning for School Principals, and it was co-authored, you can see, with four of my collaborators at the University of Washington and the University of Connecticut. And so what I'm going to do today is just tell you a little bit about what we learned, both about the mix of learning that principals told us that they were getting, what gets covered in those learning opportunities, what they found valuable, and then some implications, I think, for how we can think about building better systems, more coherent learning systems for school principals. And so the motivation for this work, so as Renee previewed, so back in 2021, I was one of the authors of a report for the Wallace Foundation that's called How Principals Affect Students in Schools. And that was an attempt to take 20 years of research on the school principalship, the last 20 years, and try to pull it together to say, what have we learned about the connection between school leadership and student outcomes? And I think the top line finding from that report could be summarized in this quote from the report, which is it's difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on its potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership. And that really came from the research that sort of the highest quality research that we have that really shows that having a successful leader implementing successful practices in a school building can be one of the biggest levers that you can pull for moving student outcomes significantly. So that was one sort of finding from that report. A second finding from that report is that actually we know something about where those investments should focus. So we should be investing, but also where should we be making those investments? And so this is an image from the report that shows the relationship between, if you focus in the middle of the figure, really what we call the high leverage domains of practice, or really the four areas that the research suggests are most closely connected, four areas of principals practice that are most closely connected to student outcomes. So we call those engaging and instructionally focused interactions with teachers. So that's like observation, feedback, coaching using data, building a productive climate. So building a school, creating a school environment where teachers can teach and kids can learn. Facilitating collaboration and professional learning community, which is about having the adults in a building be able to work together productively towards the goal of increasing student achievement. And then the fourth one is managing personnel and resources strategically. So this is really about establishing school goals and then managing all of the resources that a principal has at their disposal, which might a little bit be money, but really is thinking more about things like time and personnel and how they can orient those resources towards the pursuit of those goals. The research really suggested these are the four areas that we should really be investing in, we should really be thinking about. But then the other observation that flows from our the work and some of the subsequent thinking we've done is that even if we have this focus and that investment, the job of being a principal is so complex that even principals with the best pre-service preparation are going to have lots of growth areas. There are going to be lots of places that they're going to need learning and support. And so that really takes us to this current work, which is we really believe that professional learning can be a powerful investment in school principals. Okay. But how can learning that's in-service learning is where we're going to focus. So learning that's happening once people are already in the role, how can principals learn to improve their practice in these important areas? And we just think that's an important question for the field. But we realize we have to ask a different question or a background question or a question that needs to come first, which is, well, what does the current landscape look like? So this report is asking, what does ongoing in-service professional learning for principals actually look like? And then how can we make it better? So here's where the evidence is going to come from in the report. So we did interviews with 63 principals in Connecticut, Tennessee, and Washington. Those states were chosen because that's just where the authors were, where we had access to folks. But we interviewed 63 people in diverse contexts. They're leading rural schools, urban schools, high schools, elementary schools, high poverty schools, low poverty schools, et cetera. And we use those interviews then to also do a survey in collaboration with RAND of a nationally representative survey of about 1,000 school principals across the US so that we could say the degree to which the findings from the interviews generalize. Then we took our initial findings and we came back and we did interviews with 20 district leaders in Connecticut, Tennessee, and Washington to have them help us interpret, well, what are we finding? What does this mean for local policy and practice? And so the study focused on the four domains from our report, which is the instructional engagement domain, building a productive climate, facilitating teacher collaboration, and strategic management. And then a fifth one that the Wallace Foundation was especially interested in, which is leading for equity, or how do we create access and opportunity within schools. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to really focus in these five areas and say, well, what are the learning opportunities that leaders had? What are the formats? What are the structures of learning in those areas? What do principals find most useful? And then what do they want more of? All right. So what did we learn? Okay, well, the full report has the full range of findings, so I don't have time to sort of go through everything, but let me hit some of the most important highlights from the report. So the first finding is really about modes of learning, and we find that learning falls on a spectrum. So you can think of a spectrum that runs from less formal to more formal. So often when we think about learning, we think about professional development, formal professional development, district run workshops, district run trainings, and that certainly is a lot of that. Okay. But those are the more formal opportunities, the learning opportunities that principals have. What we really highlight in the report, though, and this really clearly came out of the interviews, is that a lot of principal learning is happening informally or in much less formal contexts. In a lot of cases, principals learning is really self-initiated. It's unstructured. It is principals identifying a need and then identifying their own learning needs and then pursuing opportunities to fill those needs. And so every principal I ever talk to is on a text thread with other principals, right, in their district, or principals from a peer network, et cetera. Can be an important source of learning, right? This grabbing expertise from other people. Okay. And so what we really want to highlight is when we think about learning, we have to think about this full range of learning, not just the workshop that is being offered to the principal, but running all the way out to these much less formal, much less structured, much more likely to be self-initiated kinds of learning opportunities that principals are seizing on. There's going to be some implications of that, which we'll talk about in just a second. So that spectrum is important, but it turns out principals are actually engaging in a lot of informal learning. So this is a quote from one of the Washington principals, just to illustrate this point, who said, well, I would say it's 50% of, they're talking about their learning. 50% is informal study. 30% is talking to other people, other principals, sending emails or texts or questions. And then maybe 20% is formal learning, right? So again, just to emphasize that we're thinking about learning opportunities, we have to kind of take our mind out of, these formal structured opportunities. A lot of the learning is not happening in those formats. So we can see this in the survey data as well. So these are 9 categories on the left that we gave principals in the survey, and we asked them, sort of how often are you doing this, engaging in these types of learning in these different areas. And then we, just for illustration purposes, we sort of converted it to a number of times per year that you might engage in this particular learning type. What you can see is that the things that are near the top, the things that are more formal, like standalone and ongoing trainings, those aren't happening nearly so often as the things that are down at the bottom, that are like informal conversations, self-directed independent learning, what we call learning by doing, which is, trying some things out in your building and evaluating them, seeing what works, and then adjusting your strategy. That can be a kind of learning as well. And so this informal learning really seems to be an important piece of the learning that's happening for school principals. And you can see on the right, we have some quotes where people are talking about the kinds of informal learning that they're engaging in. So this Connecticut principal talking about those informal conversations where you're just texting someone or you're making a quick phone call to try to pick someone's brain, right? The middle one is a Tennessee principal saying, just watching the people around me, leaders, my principal peers, watching how they take care of business, seeing things that are good, seeing things that aren't good, learning from those. But for the most part, seeing things that work really well, just stealing the heck out of everybody else's great ideas. And I will say, so some of this comes through observation, but we also had lots of principals talking to us about, well, I'm a voracious reader. I'm looking for books and articles. I'm looking for things from professional organizations. I'm searching the web to try to find ideas of places that I can go to gain new expertise or insights. And we heard a lot about podcasts, which was a bit of a surprise to us. How often principals were saying, "Well, I'm listening to things in my field that are in education, or I'm going out into the business world, listening to things that are outside of education because those are things that I need to be a better leader." Um, and then, uh, and then also principals recognizing the connection between formal and informal learning. So that often the value of the formal opportunities were the informal opportunities that they created, like this Washington principle that talks about the importance of going to conferences is largely about the connections that conferences allow you to form with people that you can follow up with later. And so this is kind of big finding number one is about the importance of informal learning, and to say, like, one of the things that we derive from our conversations with principals is the reason that informal learning seemed to be so important to them is because it could be responsive, like these emerging day-to-day needs that were rising in their buildings. It gave them an opportunity to, I've got a problem now. Where can I go to help me solve this problem of practice that needs my immediate attention? Right. So I talked about this piece already, but really that again that often formal learning people valued on their own, on its own, but also really valued the opportunity to make connections that led to future informal learning being such an important part of the organization of professional learning for school principals. All right, so that's finding number one. The second one is about content. So, and our big finding about content, meaning what's the coverage of principals professional learning, is that it gets a lot of focus on that first domain that I talked about, that instructional engagement domain, but often that there's less attention that's given to the other areas. So the image that's here on the left is a plot from the survey again, and you can see down the sort of down the rows of the different kinds of training. The dots here represent the different domains that we ask about. And the takeaway here is that red dot is instructional engagement. It's always to the right, essentially, almost always to the right of the other dots in terms of the frequency with which principals saying that they're covering that particular topic. And you can see we heard this a lot in the interviews as well, that there's a real focus on the ground on instruction, instructional improvement. How do I work with teachers around improving instruction, et cetera? And principals thought that was really important. Okay, and it's really important that we've made this shift in the principalships towards being really instructionally focused, and our goal is to drive instructional improvement. The flip side of that, though, is that we sometimes heard from principals that the focus on instruction could crowd out in other important learning needs. So you see this Washington principal in the middle, for example, who says, well, we get zero learning experiences around culture, not one thing. They, meaning the central office, talk about classroom culture and engaging students, but we don't get any professional development in that area. And so um, and we heard that, pretty consistently, that the focus on instruction really important, but also we have these other things, right? That these other areas we're supposed to be focusing on that are also going to be drivers of student achievement and other student outcomes, and we need opportunities to learn in those areas as well, and we're not necessarily getting those. And then unsurprisingly, sort of our third finding is that who gets what can really vary. The learning opportunities that principals were accessing, they weren't the same from sort of across survey respondents or certainly across interview respondents. So one piece of that is that context really matters. So something that came through is that rural principals often having access to fewer formal learning opportunities than their urban peers. They're in a smaller district, smaller central office. There might be fewer people who are sort of in charge of principal professional learning or who are there to support, coach, mentor, et cetera. And so the context piece of that of learning seems to be really important. Another contextual piece that really shined through in our data is the emphasis that issues around equity get. Gets a lot of emphasis in some places, it gets zero emphasis in others. And it's certainly at the time that we were doing these interviews, Equity was becoming a more politically contentious topic, and there were lots of principals that were even hesitant to talk to us about learning in that area because the word equity had taken on a more negative meaning. And yet, principals are still often, express a commitment to access of opportunity and so forth. But challenges around maybe feeling like they can access opportunities in those areas because of the political headwinds. Um, a second piece contextual piece is that principals really identified finding time as a main learning challenge. So, sort of this Tennessee principal's quote that I'll just leave here is really sort of emblematic. Principals saying, I'd really like to have more time to invest in my own learning. It's just, I'm drinking from a fire hose all day long because of the challenges of my job. And so, really trying to carve out the opportunities to engage in more professional learning is really hard. And then a third contextual piece down at the bottom is that principals are getting different opportunities at different career stages. So the early career folks were reporting getting much less coaching and much less formal mentoring than their later career colleagues. That's probably not that surprising. But principals also found those kinds of opportunities really impactful. And so I think it's just kind of points to the importance of thinking about principals learning across the career because, executives of Fortune 500 companies, they often have coaches throughout, right? That's not coaching is not seen as, oh, something a person just needs right at the beginning of their career. Principals often found this is something I get in my initial years. I get that much less as I progress through, and maybe that is a place that we could think about creating more opportunities for principals to learn. And then the fourth area is around principals' needs. So in the survey and often in the interviews, principals really expressed they really appreciated the opportunities that they had. Almost 90% told us, "Oh, the learning opportunities I have really push my leadership forward." And two-thirds said that they were satisfied overall with the learning opportunities that they had. But about half of the principals in the survey said they just don't get enough opportunities to learn, that they're sort of thirsting for more, and those opportunities are not there. So the top areas of unmet need that principals identified, sort of stepping a little bit outside of our framework, principals said, well, I need to know a lot more about special ed. Special education is a big area I'm dealing with, and I don't get lots of learning opportunities there. Issues around student discipline and behavior, new strategies to address discipline and behavior were coming up a lot, and also issues around student mental health. Those came up, I would say, the most frequently in the interviews. And this real perception among principals that there's been a bit of a sea change in the post-COVID years, where there's a real need to address issues around discipline, behavior, student mental health that they didn't have that experience with prior, and the opportunities to learn in those areas maybe not keeping up with the demands that schools that are arising in schools for in those areas. And then the last thing that I'll mention here are what the implications for people at sort of the state level, because we were taking a very micro view, but we also had this opportunity to engage with district level policymakers to think a little bit about the implications or understanding of the results, and just to take a state level view about why this stuff might matter. Just to repeat, I think states really should be investing in principal learning because principals are such a high leverage investment in a school system. And so opportunities to improve their practice are going to translate into better outcomes for kids. So what are the opportunities to improve practice? Well, that's all about learning, right? And yet what we show is that the opportunities to learn are really uneven across districts and often leave it to principals to seek out opportunities on their own. And I think that's a place where we at least can think about where state policy might make a difference. So what are some levers that folks at the state level can pull? Well, one is always money, right? To think about how states might invest more in principal learning, especially investing more in principal learning at the rate that matches its impact, all right, on schools. So principals are so important in terms of their impact on the people in their building, and yet they're often an afterthought when we think about funding for things like professional development. We really are focused on teachers, and we definitely should be focused on teachers, but to really make learning around leadership as much of a focus, there's a big opportunity there. I think a second one is opportunities to streamline state mandates. Principals told us a lot that well, I might get some learning time, but the learning time that I get is often has to be devoted to things that are not very valuable to me. And that seems to be an issue in some states more than others. And so, really, to think about how we can create space for principals that learning for principals that they're going to find useful, I think is a useful state role. A third one is how we can think about building regional infrastructure and opportunities. And this is thinking specifically about that sort of urban and rural gap. It's certainly not the case. We had lots of rural principals actually that had good opportunities. It's just less often in the rural context that principals were really reporting that they had access to these really robust opportunities. And so there could be a state role there to think about funding or seeding or setting up cross district networks. We have what's called the Rural Principals Network in Tennessee, for example. It's been a really successful way to connect principals in rural contexts. That's been really, I hear all the time from principals about how valuable that has been. So thinking about cross-district networks or mentoring coaching opportunities for people in smaller districts who often don't have that capacity readily available to them. And then the fourth one is, and we talked a lot about in our district interviews about this, was the opportunity that presents itself to curate and vet quality resources. Because if principals are going to be seeking things out on their own, a lot of the district folks told us that was kind of a two-sided coin. Because on the one hand, you want principals to be sort of in charge of their own learning and to be able to have the opportunity to self-initiate. The flip side of that, though, is what if that self-initiation that leads them down the road towards kind of low quality resources or resources that are not necessarily aligned to priorities of the district or maybe priorities of the state. So there could be an opportunity there as well to think about how we, create a clearinghouse of high quality materials that principals can access, can be more efficient, and also maybe an opportunity to improve the quality of what principals are accessing. Because obviously state priorities are creating the conditions for local actors. I mean, I still think local actors are going to be sort of the predominant focus in the principal learning area. Districts are still going to be the ones that have to make learning relevant and help principals find quality resources and protect talent calendar time for learning. It's really hard to do that from the state level, right? Principals have things that if they're going to be lifelong learners, that they have to do for themselves as well. I think the question at the state level is how can we make these local efforts easier, better resourced, and less dependent on any one district's capacity to ensure that principals can get what they need, right? So you can just read these mostly repetitive of things that I've already said, sort of going back through the key takeaways, but I'll point you to the fourth one to say that this was really our big conclusion, sort of we got to at the end of the report, just thinking about how the path forward really is more coordination in this area, trying to build more coherence. Principals really want high quality learning opportunities to be readily available. And so I think what's incumbent upon the folks that help design those systems is to think about how they can provide what principals really are demanding, because in a lot of places, those resources don't necessarily exist, right? All right, that's what I've got for you. So look forward to your questions and some discussion.